talking with BradOvenell Carter, who is the Director of Educational Technology at Mulgrave School, which is a K-12 independent school in Vancouver, Canada. And I'm particularly interested in what you're doing, Brad, because many of the interviews I've done have been about empowering students to
Mm.
take charge of their learning. And that's a little scary to many teachers and more administrators and even more parents. So why don't you tell us about, in the big picture sense, why and how you do that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, if however we want to describe the future of education, and I think everybody in education recognizes that something's going on. It's changing, and we're kind of building the plane as we fly, and not quite sure what it is. But at the end of the day, I think we'd all agree it has something to do with engaging students more, making it, whether we say it's making it relevant, whether we say it's personalized or differentiated or whatever, something's happening where we're making this shift from teachers as content holders and delivery people to something where the kids are much more engaged in the process of discovery and learning and so forth. So, we might think of sort of education 1.0 or something like that as a kind of a Cartesian model where I have some knowledge and I'll give it to you if you do certain things. Like when you reach a certain age or when you performed at a certain level in school, I'll give you some more. And our language reflects that. I'll say, let me give you a piece of advice, or I have something you might be interested in, as if I had a concrete object that I could give to you. And that's really good for some kinds of learning, for things like disseminating trivial knowledge. Things, facts and figures that we can look up. It's very efficient, that sort of one-to-many model. But it does create a culture of dependency. I have to wait until, Howard, you give me permission to get some more knowledge. I can't move it at my own pace. Um, and, I think we can shift that to something that might be, in fact, oddly, a really ancient way, much closer to oral traditions of knowledge, where we work together to come to an understanding of some kind. So what my students and I are engaged in, I teach a theory of knowledge course. That's one of the International Baccalaureate program's core courses. Very fortunate to have a small class this year, just 8 students, so we can really experiment with how do we construct knowledge. So, instead of me handing it out, we sit there and look for a problem, things that I don't even know the answer to, and we start searching the world, or the situation for what's important to us. Maybe we know a lot of stuff, so the things that I thought were important aren't really that important to us. We're looking for new ways to find knowledge. It's a much more collaborative process. And the key thing, and the frightening thing as a teacher, is I have to say, I don't know, right? Let's go find out. The upside as a teacher is it's a tremendously exciting way to teach. And lately, I don't think I've taught my class the same way twice. It's always fresh, it's always new, and I'm learning as much as the kids are. So I think what we're talking about is this huge shift from me having sort of a standardized content or something that I dole out at some kind of rate, depending on age and ability and things like that, to something where we're walking into a new situation and building it together with the kids. That's a radical shift for us all.
It sounds to me like you're saying that you don't have a fixed syllabus that you present to the students, but that the students in some way co-create the syllabus. How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, we still have, there's still mandated outcomes that could be, come from, state level. Here, the province of British Columbia says here are certain learning outcomes, and we're an international baccalaureate school, so they have some outcomes. Um, but there are a lot of ways to get to those outcomes. As a teacher, I know what I want these kids to do more or less within this age group. There's some kind of developmental sensibility there. But a teacher ought to be able to say, look, one of the biggest variable in the classroom is the students. It's a funny thing where we think that teachers and students can be interchanged equally. It doesn't really matter who your students are. It doesn't really matter who the teacher is. You just get assigned a teacher and I just get assigned some students. I don't think that works that way. I mean, the real variable are the people, and we have to work. It's kind of like a play, like theater. Great theater engages the audience in some way, and the performance is never the same way twice. And I think we can borrow some of that for education. So we can still drive to these outcomes. And don't get me wrong, I think content is really important. I have a huge library at home. I love content. You can't work without it. You know, you couldn't write a poem that went something like, I've never seen a poem as lovely as a tree, if you didn't know what a poem and a tree were. You need to have some basic knowledge in there. And I still think there's a place for, call it the baseline literacy or grammar of every subject, but we can move beyond that. And we don't have to wait 12 years to do that. We can engage very young kids in this process. So, the model that my students and I are working on is kind of a three-step thing. We start with a baseline literacy. There is some core content that you need to know. And that's sort of a typical kind of class. School is very good at doing that. So for an example, a couple of years back, I was head of a school called Think Global School. This was a global mobile high school. There's no building anywhere on the planet for it. We just flew students and faculty into 3 different cities over the course of the year and lived and studied. So with this idea that the best way to learn about the world is to learn in the world. So we're in Sydney Harbour, Sydney, Australia. And one of the projects we got to take part in was a longitudinal study of the health of the harbour. And this was run by the University of Sydney. And what that meant was counting sea urchins on the floor of Sydney Harbour. Now, sea urchins are like a canary species. So we had to teach the kids some baseline literacy. We had to teach them how to scuba dive. We had to teach them some statistics because we're going to go count animals and make assessments of that. And we had to teach them how to lay underwater transit lines so they could actually properly go and count the critters on the ocean floor. So there's that baseline literacy stuff. And then we go out and we go into the field and we do this stuff. So we just go out in this big data gathering mission and we start capturing data all kinds of ways. Underwater photographs, writing on underwater slates, coming up and talking. And then we get on the beach and we do a big dump of all this data. And we would have a marine biologist with us and we'd say, we saw this, is it important? We saw that, is that important? Is there anything we missed? Somebody would identify an area they couldn't get deep enough or something. But it's this big assessment of our knowledge. And that's the critical step, is where as students and teachers, we step into the room or we go to the museum or whatever we do, we look at all the data we have and we put it on the table, so to speak, and we assess it. We never give kids the opportunity to assess and learn how to assess the data. We present it to them as kind of a fait accompli. And then from there, we look for a problem that maybe nobody knows the answer to. So if Education 1.0 was problem solving, go to page 10, do questions 1 to 20 by Thursday. And Education 2.0 was problem-based learning. I'll give you a challenging problem and you'll be motivated to go do all that base work in order to solve the problem. The problem with that is, though, it's not really a problem because I already know the answer. And so what we're trying to move now is to call it Ed 3.0, where we're trying to identify problems for which nobody has the answer, not even the teacher. And that's really exciting. And I think the thing for the kids is I get excited about that, and my excitement is the thing I think that helps it get the kids engaged, I as a teacher.
Well, for example,
Yeah.
what are examples of problems that not even the teacher knows the answer to that you have successfully turned into learning?
Sure. Well, that Sydney Harbour study, I mean, nobody knows the answer yet. This is part of a longitudinal study. So one of the other criteria we're saying is we need to produce legacy projects. That is, we need to do things as human beings that have value to other people. If at the end of the year my students feel like they can throw out their book of notes, then I think that's a grave moral problem. There are only 2 times in our lives where we're deprived of civil liberties. One is when we break the law and are convicted and go to jail. The second one is when we go to school. So in that case, if we're taking away liberty from kids, we have a heavy, heavy moral obligation to do meaningful work with them. So I think the outcome of student work, I mean, you can't do this every day, but it should drive towards things that have real value. So that Sydney Harbour sea urchin thing, our data went into a much bigger data pool that was really genuinely important to the university and to the city of Sydney. So that's where we're engaging in real work. And at the other end, at a much smaller scale, I teach the IB Theory of Knowledge course. And the IB recently introduced a new metaphor for the structure of knowledge. They said we can think of knowledge as a map. And so maps have layers. They've got a latitude and longitude layer. They've got a topo layer, and they've got colors and things. So I went to my students and says, IB tells us that we can think of knowledge as a map. I don't know if that's true or not. This is new to me. So let's make a map. And the kid said, sure, Mr. OC, what does that look like? And I go, I haven't the foggiest idea. Let's make one. So we grabbed a stack of atlases and some big pieces of paper and crayons and scissors, everything you could think, and just sat down for a couple of weeks making a map. And the process was fascinating because the kids would say, I think we can represent the areas of knowledge as continents. So we cut out chunks of map and glued them together in continents. And then we tested it to see if it held up. We gave it challenges. Could we model mathematics as something different from arts, let's say? And we go, yup. And then we had to model, we kept layering all these things we wanted to model, and we kept testing it to see if it would hold up as a metaphor. And I think we've got it now. We've been playing with it. We've been doing some real-world testing where we've got this map now, which represents human knowledge, and there are some moving pieces on it. So we have the continents represent areas of knowledge, and we have these little sailboats which represent the ways of knowing, sort of sense perception, emotion, language, the tools we use to acquire knowledge. And so we have these boats sailing around this fictitious world. And it looks like we can actually model the way knowledge moves around in classrooms. So the students are going out and observing a physics class and observing an English class and looking at how knowledge transfers. So the next step of that is to actually present that to the International Baccalaureate Organization and say, look, we think this is what your map looks like. So we haven't got that part. We'll have that finished by the end of the year. But it's the kind of thing where the kids are now not being passive recipients of stuff. They're engaging with things that the adult world is giving them and asking good questions. They're not being flipped. They're, there's kind of a qualified ability to question that comes out of this. On a smaller scale, we've had kids produce little tutorials for other students. So it could be that a grade 3 teacher is having a hard time explaining the concept of fractions. So let's get a grade 5 class to produce some content there and have them learn to do some of the tool making, video making or whatever, and produce stuff for other classes. But through all of that, I'm still confident that the kids are getting what they need to get in my class in particular, theory of knowledge stuff. There's specialized language, there's a discussion about epistemology, and they're engaging this with real content that's relevant to them. It's not abstract stuff that comes out of a textbook.
You've talked about the students as curators, the place where the kind of pedagogy of student as curator meets the technology. You've talked about making these mashups of different technologies. Can you just paint us a picture of how that looks?
Yeah, I think that middle step I talked about a moment ago, where we've gone and we've capture a bunch of data and then dump it on the table and examine it, explore it, roll it around. I think it's these digital tools that allow us to do that in a way we've never been able to do that before. So a group of kids could go to a museum with some iPhones or iTouches, a camera, and some things like that, and just start capturing data. You can photograph it, you can video it, you can audio record it, you can type it up. And what makes it work is being able to label all of this stuff. If you imagine some archaeologists on a dig, and you pull up all these bones and you stick a little label and you say where you got it, what you think it is, and you describe its location, put it in context, and you bring all of that stuff back. So to start with, we were looking for a tool that allowed that quick capture and label, and we decided that Twitter was going to be our number one tool. So my students and I live tweet our classes all the time. That's our official note-taking tool is Twitter. We looked at some other things, Google Documents, for example, but they were too slow. You had to log in and open up a document. Kids have camera phones with them, so you can quickly send out a tweet. I had one of my students, Leonard Cohen, was up here last year, and he's also an artist, so we had an art show on. And one of my students was at his art gallery on a Saturday night, took out his phone, took a picture, and sent out a tweet using the hashtag for our Theory of Knowledge class, and captured some data that connected to a discussion we had in the week. So now I know my student is thinking about theory of knowledge outside of classroom hours, is contributing to our larger body of knowledge. So step one is this capture. Everything gets tweeted all the time. Now, we know that Twitter tweets have a shelf life. They disappear after a week or two. So we have a Google script that goes out and looks through a Twitter account and captures everything with the hashtag, our official class hashtag, and dumps it into a Google spreadsheet. So whenever anybody tweets anything, they know it's permanently captured. They label it with a couple of hashtags. We now have this huge data archive that we can go back and mine at any time. The first year we did this, my students sent out 12,000 tweets. The spreadsheet has a whole bunch of metadata. We actually blew up a Google spreadsheet. That's over 440,000 cells of data that these students created using this script. So we have this huge collection of knowledge. We don't even know what we can do with it all, but at least we've got our hands on it. And this is a big focus in industry as well. If you talk about the impact of technology on business, the big word is now just capture the data. You don't know what you can do with it yet, and we'll have new tools that will allow us to analyze it later. But if you don't have the data, it's all moot. So we do the Twitter thing, then we archive everything in a Google spreadsheet. And periodically what I'll do is I'll have the kids go through and mine the data, pull out what we think is important. If 3 or 4 of us said more or less the same thing, that's an important point for us. Somehow it's relevant. So that's going to go into our official sort of textbook that we're building. And we use Storify to gather up all of that stuff. So I'll have a group of students use Storify to pull those tweets in, plus any links that are mentioned in the tweet. So now we have what is kind of like the written text of our textbook, all done as a Storify collection. And then the final layer on top of that, 2 more things. One of our students is a really good sketchnote artist. So she'll build a series of sketch notes. So if we have a discussion for 3 or 4 classes on a subject, she will continuously sketch note. So at the end of it, we now have this Storify collection of the highlighted tweets and all the links that they mentioned. We'll have her sketch note on top, which is like a high-level abstract or executive summary. And then we use our final tool is ThingLink, which allows you to hyperlink any point on a JPEG or a PNG file. So we take a photo of her sketch notes, and then we use ThingLink to put the hyperlink to the Storify plus extraneous bits of information. So now what we build is a 1-page summary, which is sketch notes. So we've got this very high-level view of our discussion and what we discovered, with hyperlinks that will drill down into the Storify thing, which will go really deep, plus some other connections that might not have been directly part of our conversation, but give it some relevance, expand the context, kind of link to, I don't know, what if, maybe we'll explore this later. And so this huge exotic mashup of tools, which is a lot of fun, is giving us this kind of reflective sort of loop. We talk, we think about it, it goes into the spreadsheet, we pull things out, we think this is important, and then we say, okay, what does that mean for us? And then we use that to connect to the next chapter as we build that. That's been a long time figuring out how to make all this work. It's been almost 2 years of work, but I think we're almost there now. And what we'd like to see is to be able to automate it a little bit more. But a couple of things that have come out of that is to recognize, one, that I think as teachers we've got to get our heads out of this, what app do I use for that, and start to think of the mashup. Maybe the one app isn't going to do that, but let me play around with a couple of things and mash them all together. And the other part, which is, I think, a really liberating thing. Like, I work in a very well-off school. We're an Ivy League prep school kind of thing. Kids are very well off, and we're very fortunate to have our hands on a lot of technology. But what if you're working in a school that doesn't? And that's the majority of schools, right? We're finding that we really like to work in this kind of hybrid analog-digital world where we've got a kid sketchnoting, and spontaneously my students will go up to the board and start drawing on the board. They'll draw diagrams and do all of this stuff. So you can work on paper, on the board, or whatever. And if you have one single iPhone or something like that in your class, you can take photos. Somebody can be the official tweeter, hashtag them, dump them all into a spreadsheet. You need one laptop and one smartphone, and you can do all of this as effectively as somebody who's got a one-to-one program. This whole talk about one-to-one is quite funny to me. I mean, it's great when you have it. And it's really nice to have access to the tools in your pocket, so you don't have to stop what you're doing to look things up. But, as I was talking about before, this kind of collaborative approach, if we walk into the classroom and instead of saying we need to give everybody paper and everybody pencils and everybody a laptop, dump onto the table what assets does the group have? And let's work with that. Both physical assets or hardware and things like that, but also skill assets. Like I said, I've got one teacher or a student who's a talented artist. So why don't you be our sketchnote artist? You don't have to worry about taking detailed notes because I've got another student who's a whiz at taking typewritten notes. So he will take the typewritten notes in exchange for your sketch notes kind of thing. So the whole room becomes smarter than a whole bunch of individuals can if everybody's doing the same thing. But the radical shift is it's now built on trust. And I think our existing structures are not built on trust. They're built on dependency and control. I need to be able to build a system. And I get it. As a school and as a school administrator, we have a job to get all kids through to whatever these prescribed outcomes are. And right now, one way that works is this kind of, the sort of standard education we've got, where, I march you through some stuff, you write an exam later, and I can demonstrate that you know this stuff. But it's a huge risk to say, Howard, you're going to take some typewritten notes, Brad, you're going to draw some pictures, somebody else is going to do some audio recordings, and still be sure that everybody can sit the exam at the end of the year. But I think we can do that. Now, in theory of knowledge, I've got the luxury of not having sort of heavy standardized exams. They write an essay and they do a presentation. But I think it's a good place to experiment with some of these ideas and then start to push them into some of these other subject areas. Definitely challenges ahead. I've got a colleague who's a brilliant mathematician and another one who's a chemistry teacher, and they have huge amounts of content to go through. And I'm not sure you could kind of co-create a textbook with kids. But I do think there's some way to engage with it differently than what we have so far.
I know from my own experience with college students that moving from authority to trust is a little bit of a rocky road for both the teacher and the students. When I say I want to give you some of my teacher power and I want you to take some more responsibility for your learning, there's some. Not only have they not exercised those muscles, why should they trust that? So I look for opportunities. I'm assigned forum posts, and after a couple of weeks, I say, "Well, how do you like the forum?" And a couple of times the students have said, "Why can't we use Facebook? We all live on Facebook." And I'll say, "Well, I think that the forum indexes threads a lot better than Facebook, but if you think that that's where you want to have this conversation, why not? Let's go try it."
Right.
So once you can solicit an honest opinion of how things are going from them and take the risk to go ahead and do what they want to do, even though you probably suspect that it's not the best way to do it, then that's the beginning of that kind of trust building.
I think so. I think so.
One closing word of advice to educators who want to start down this path, whether or not they are in a privileged school where you can have 8 students and one-to-one technology.
Yeah, I'd say start small with something you can kind of get away with. We know, even here I've got a lot of flexibility. I still know that I'm kind of pushing the envelope, and my envelope's just different than yours. I'm still pushing it, kind of thing. And look for those small successes and build from there. It's a lot easier to go to, whoever you report to. It could be your head of department, it could be a divisional principal or something like that, if you've got a success. So pick something that's relatively low stakes, but allows you to get at something. For example, like let's try it on Facebook or something like that. Now, there's a whole discussion about whether you can actually use Facebook and maybe you can't do that with your grade 5 kids because they're not 13 and that sort of thing. But find something like that. Let's say, let's play with this and have that honest conversation with the kids, engage them in the process. And take the chance. But take it on something is low stakes, but the outcome will give you proof of concept. That, look, these kids were engaged, I could see it. Maybe set it up so that you've got a kind of a pre-test and then something post where you've got some real data. Was it Chip Heath's book, Switch, where he talks about the 3 things we have to engage if we want to have change. He has this metaphor of the rider on an elephant going down a jungle path. The rider is the analytical person who decides where we're going, and that tends to be school administrators, and they respond to data, right? If you can show me that the kids perform better or we're going to save a bunch of money, I'm interested, because that's my job as an administrator, to make sure the kids do well and that we're improving scores and that we operate the whole organization efficiently. The elephant is the emotional part of things, and sometimes you have to make an emotional appeal. Very hard to get going, but once it gets going, it's very hard to stop, right? So you have to decide, maybe those are parents tend to be the emotional thing. You have to show people that it's going to be safe for the kids to be working in social media, for example. And the last one that we forget about most often is the path. And our physical environment and our cultural environment really shapes our behavior. And we have to figure out what that is. And that's often the most difficult to change. But we can do that in a small way. So if you kind of keep those three things in mind, devise an experiment that will engage those things, keep it low risk, maybe it's around a single assignment. Let's try writing our poetry collaboratively. That game, Exquisite Corpse, where you write a line and fold the thing down. Let's do that, but do it openly online. Maybe that would be it. Take the risk of working openly, being radically transparent. Let everybody know you're going to do it. Do it with something that's, again, low stakes. Let's write our poetry online today. Let the parents know, let the administration know you're doing it, and see what happens. We started, just as an example of what happened, when we started tweeting with the kids, people were kind of skeptical, but in the middle of our conversation, this fellow jumps in on our conversation, and the kids are chatting away, and I go, everybody stop. You need to know who this is. This is the Deputy Chief Assessor for the Theory of Knowledge course for the entire International Baccalaureate organization. He's now having a conversation with my 8 students. He's in Sweden, we're in Canada. That would never happen before. So now my kids have direct access to one of the senior guys in their field of study. And that just came because we were willing to have our conversation in the open.
I've done a lot of talking with people doing learning in the open. The DS 106
Right.
course does that a great deal. And I've been convinced to convince my students to set up their own WordPress blogs and learn in the open. Well, thanks, Brad. This is fascinating, and I hope some people look to the path that you've blazed and go try it themselves.
I hope so too. I'd love to connect with anybody else who's doing that. Amy Burvall, whom you've interviewed here before, her students and my students have a loose conversation going back through Twitter using these hashtags kinds of things. But just because I'm trying to scale up my own work here, I'm really interested in anybody else who's doing this kind of stuff, playing around with different tools, mashing them up, working out in the open, sharing your data. I just think we've all got a lot more to learn if we do, because no one of us can know everything.
Okay, I'll put more information in the blog post so that other educators can connect their classes to your class.
Great.
Okay, thanks so much, Brad.
Thanks, Howard. Take care.